Famrui Inglawana Kadulorali Fadaga. Famrui Inglawana Kadulorali Fadaga. Famrui Inglawana Kadulorali Fadaga.
Welcome to the 213th of the Cthulhu podcasts. I'm Felbrick. Today we're starting off with the next part of Mr. Standfast. Then we'll have a musical number from 1934, and then back to the King in Yellow. Let's get started. Chapter 11. The Valley of Humiliation. I collected some baggage and a pile of newly arrived letters from my rooms in Westminster, and took a taxi to my Park Lane flat. Usually I'd gone back to that old place with a great feeling of comfort, like a boy from school who ranges about his room at home and examines his treasures. I used to like to see my hunting trophies on the wall, and to sink into my own armchairs. But now I had no pleasure in the thing. I had a bath, changed into a uniform, and that made me feel in better fighting trim. But I suffered from a heavy conviction of abject failure, and had no share in McGillivray's optimism. The awe with which the Black Stone gang had filled me 3 years before had revived 1,000-fold. Personal humiliation was the least part of my trouble. What worried me was the sense of being up against something inhumanly formidable and wise and strong. I believed I was willing to own defeat and chuck up the game. Among the unopened letters was one from Peter, a very bulky one which I sat down to read at leisure. It was a curious epistle, far the longest he had ever written me, and its size made me understand his loneliness. He was still at his German prison camp, but expecting every day to go to Switzerland. He said he could get back to England or South Africa if he wanted, for they were clear that he could never be a combatant again. But he thought it had better stay in Switzerland, for he would be unhappy in England with all his friends fighting. As usual, he made no complaints, and seemed to be very grateful for his small mercies. There was a doctor who was kind to him, and some good fellows amongst the prisoners. But Peter's letter was made up chiefly of reflection. He had always been a bit of a philosopher, and now, in his isolation, he had taken to thinking hard, and poured out the results to me on pages of thin paper in his clumsy handwriting. I could read between the lines that he was having a stiff fight with himself. He was trying to keep his courage going in the face of the bitterest trial he had ever been called on to face, a crippled old age. He had always known a good deal about the Bible. That and the Pilgrim's Progress were his chief aids in reflection. Both he took quite literally, as if they were newspaper reports of actual recent events. He mentioned that after much consideration he had reached the conclusion that the 3 greatest men he had ever heard of or met were Mr. Valiant for Truth, the Apostle Paul, and a certain Billy Strang, who had been with him in Mazaland in 92. Billy I knew all about. He'd been Peter's hero and leader till a lion got him in Blauberg. Peter preferred Valiant for Truth to Mr. Greatheart, I think, because of his superior truculence, for being very gentle himself, he loved a bold speaker. After that he dropped into a vein of self-examination. He regretted that he fell far short of any of the 3. He thought that he might, with luck, resemble Mr. Standfast, for like him he had not much trouble in keeping wakeful, and was also as poor as a howler, and didn't care for women. He'd only hoped that he could imitate him in making a good end. Then followed some remarks of Peter's on courage, which came to me in that London room as if spoken by his living voice. I've never known anyone so brave by instinct, or anyone who hated so much to be told so. It was almost the only thing that could make him angry. All his life he'd been facing death, and to take risks seemed to him as natural as to get up in the morning and to eat his breakfast. But he had started out to consider the very thing which before he had taken for granted. And here is an extract from his conclusions. I paraphrase him, for he was not grammatical. It's easy enough to be brave if you're feeling well and have food inside you. And it's not so difficult even if you're short of a meal and seedy, for that makes you inclined to gamble. I mean by being brave, playing the game by the right rules without letting it worry you that you may very likely get knocked on the head. It's the wisest way to save your skin. It doesn't do to think about death if you're facing a charging lion or trying to bluff a lot of savages. If you think about it, you'll get it. If you don't, the odds are you won't. That kind of courage is only good nerves and experience. Most courage is experience. Most people are a little scared at new things. You want a bigger heart to face down danger, which you go out of your way to look for, and which doesn't come to you in the ordinary way of business. Still, that's pretty much the same thing. Good nerves, good health, and a natural liking for rows. You see, Dick, in all that game, there's a lot of fun. There's excitement and the fun of using your wits and skill, and you know that the bad bits can't last long. When Arkell sent me to Macapan's kraal, I didn't altogether fancy the job, but at the worst, it was 3 parts sport, and I got so excited that I never thought of the risk until it was over. But the big courage is the cold-blooded kind, the kind that never lets go even when you're feeling empty inside and your blood's thin, and there's no kind of fun or profit to be had, and the trouble's not over in an hour or two, but lasts for months and years. One of the men here was speaking about that kind, and he called it fortitude. I reckon fortitude's the biggest thing a man can have. You just go on enduring when there's no guts or heart left in you. Billy had it when he trekked solitary from Guanagos to the Limpopo with fever and a broken arm, just to show the Portuguese that he wouldn't be downed by them. But the head man at the job was the Apostle Paul. Peter was writing for his own comfort, for fortitude was all that was left to him now. But his words came pretty straight to me, and I read them again and again, for I needed the lesson. Here was I, losing heart just because I had failed in the first round, and my pride had taken a knock. I felt honestly ashamed of myself, and that made me a far happier man. There could be no question of dropping the business, whatever its difficulties. I had a queer religious feeling that Ivory and I had had our fortunes intertwined, and that no will of mine could keep us apart. I had faced him before the war, and won. I'd faced him again, and lost. The 3rd time, or the 20th time, we would reach a final decision. The whole business had hitherto appeared to me a trifle unreal, at any rate my own connection with it. I'd been docilely obeying orders, but my real self had been standing aside and watching my doings with a certain aloofness. But that hour in the tube station had brought me into the serum, and I saw the affair not as Bullivant's or even Blenkerron's, but as my own. Before, I had been itching to get back to the front. Now I wanted to get onto Ivory's trail, though it should take me through the nether pit. Peter was right. Fortitude was the thing a man must possess if he would save his soul. The hours passed, and as I expected, there came no word from McGillivray. I had some dinner sent up to me at about 7 o'clock, and about 8 I was thinking of looking up Blenkerron. Just then came a telephone call asking me to go round to Sir Walter Bullivant's house in Queen Anne's Gate. 10 minutes later I was ringing the bell, and the door was opened to me by the same impassive butler who had admitted me on that famous night 3 years before. Nothing had changed in the pleasant green-panelled hall. The alcove was the same as when I'd watched from it the departure of the man who now called himself Ivory. The telephone book lay in the very place from which I'd snatched it in order to ring up the First Sea Lord, and in the back room, where that night 5 anxious officials had conferred, I found Sir Walter and Blenkerron. Both looked worried, the American feverishly so. He walked up and down the hearthrug, sucking an unlit black cigar. "Say, Dick," he said, "this is a bad business. Wasn't no fault of yours. You did fine. It was us, me and Sir Walter and Mr. McGillivray, that were the quitters." "Any news?" I asked. "So far the cover's drawn blank," Sir Walter replied. "It was the devil's own work that our friend looked your way today. You're pretty certain he saw that you recognized him?" "Absolutely. As sure as that he knew I recognized him in your hall 3 years ago, when he was swaggering as Lord Alloa." "No," said Blenkerron dolefully. "That little flicker of recognition is just the one thing you can't be wrong about. Land alive, I wish Mr. McGillivray would come." The bell rang, and the door opened, and it was not McGillivray. It was a young girl in a white ball gown with a cluster of blue cornflowers at her breast. The sight of her fetched Sir Walter out of his chair so suddenly that he upset his coffee cup. "Mary, my dear, how did you manage it? I didn't expect you until the late train." "I was in London, you see, and they telephoned on your telegram. I'm staying with Aunt Doria, and I cut her theatre party. She thinks I'm at Shandwick's dance, so I needn't go home until morning. Good evening, General Hannay. You got over the hill difficulty?" "The next stage is the Valley of Humiliation," I answered. "So it would appear," she said gravely, and sat quietly upon the edge of Sir Walter's chair with her small cool hand upon his. I'd been picturing her in my recollection as very young and glimmering, a dancing exquisite child. But now I revised that picture. The crystal freshness of morning was still there, but I saw how deep the waters were. It was the clean fineness and strength of her that entranced me. I didn't even think of her as pretty any more than a man thinks of the good looks of a friend he worships. We waited, hardly speaking a word, till McGillivray came. The first sight of his face told the story. "Gone?" said Blenkiron sharply. The man's lethargic calm seemed to have wholly deserted him. "Gone," repeated the newcomer. "We've just tracked him down. Oh, he managed it cleverly. Never a sign of disturbance in any of his lairs. His dinner ordered at Biggleswick, and several people invited to stay with him for the weekend, one a member of the government. 2 meetings at which he was to speak arranged for next week. Early this afternoon he flew over to France as a passenger in one of the new planes. He'd been mixed up with the airboard people for months, of course as another man with another face. Miss Lamington discovered that, but just too late. The bus went out of its course and came down in Normandy. By this time our man's in Paris or beyond it." Sir Walter took off his big tortoise-shell spectacles and laid them carefully on the table. "Roll up the map of Europe," he said. "This is our Austerlitz. Mary, my dear, I'm feeling very old." McGillivray had the sharpened face of a bitterly disappointed man. Blenkiron had got very red, and I could see that he was blaspheming violently under his breath. Mary's eyes were quiet and solemn. She kept on patting Sir Walter's hand. The sense of some great impending disaster hung heavily on me, and to break the spell I asked for details. "Tell me just the extent of the damage," I asked. "A neat plan for deceiving the Boche has failed. That is bad. A dangerous spy has got beyond our power. That's worse. Tell me, is there still a worst? What's the limit of mischief he can do?" Sir Walter had risen and joined Blenkiron on the hearthrug. His brows were furrowed and his mouth hard, as if he were suffering pain. "There is no limit," he said. "None that I can see, except the long suffering of God. You know the man as Ivory, and you knew him as that other whom you believed to have shot one summer morning and decently buried. You feared the second, at least if you didn't, I did, most mortally. You realized that we feared Ivory, and you knew enough about him to see his fiendish cleverness. Well, you have the 2 men combined in one. Ivory was the best brain McGillivray and I ever encountered, the most cunning and patient and long-sighted. Combine him with the other, the chameleon who can blend himself with his environment, and has as many personalities as there are types and traits on Earth. What kind of enemy is that to have to fight?" "I admit it's a steep proposition," I said. "But after all, how much ill can he do? There are pretty strict limits to the activity of even the cleverest spy." "I agree. But this man is not a spy who buys a few wretched subordinates and steals a dozen private letters. He's a genius who's been living as part of our English life. There's nothing he hasn't seen. He's been on terms of intimacy with all kinds of politicians. We know that. He did it as Ivory. They rather liked him, for he was clever and flattered them, and they told him things. But God knows what he saw and heard in his other personalities. For all I know, he may have breakfasted at Downing Street with letters of introduction from President Wilson, or visited the Grand Fleet as a distinguished neutral. Then think of the women, how they talk. We're the leakiest society on earth, and we safeguard ourselves by keeping dangerous people out of it. We trust to our outer barrage, But anyone who has really slipped inside has a million chances. And this, remember, is one man in 10 millions. A man whose brain never sleeps for a moment, who is quick to seize the slightest hint, who can piece a plan together out of a dozen bits of gossip. It's as if the chief of the intelligence department were suddenly to desert to the enemy. The ordinary spy knows only bits of unconnected facts. This man knows our life and our way of thinking, and everything about us. Well, but a treatise on English life in time of war won't do much good to the Boche. Sir Walter shook his head. Don't you realize the explosive stuff that's lying about? Ivory knows enough to make the next German peace offensive really deadly. Not the blundering thing which has been up to now, but something which gets our weak spots on the raw. He knows enough to wreck our campaign in the field. And the awful thing is that we don't know what he knows or what he's aiming for. This war's a packet of surprises. Both sides are struggling for the margin, the little fraction of advantage, and between evenly matched enemies it's just the extra atom of foreknowledge that tells. Then we've got to push off and get after him, I said cheerfully. But what are you going to do? Asked McGillivray. If it were merely a question of destroying an organisation, it might be managed. For an organisation presents a big front, and it's a question of destroying this one man, and his front is a razor edge. How are you going to find him? It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, and such a needle. A needle which has become a piece of straw or a tin tack when it chooses. All the same, we've got to do it, I said, remembering old Peter's lesson on fortitude, though I can't say I was feeling very stout-hearted. Sir Walter flung himself wearily into an armchair. I wish I could be an optimist, he said, but it looks as if we own defeat. I've been at this work for 20 years, and though I've often been beaten, I've always held certain cards in the game. Now I'm hanged if I've any. Looks like a knockout, Hanny. It's no good deluding ourselves. We're men enough to look the facts in the face and tell ourselves the truth. I don't see any ray of light in this business. We've missed our shot by a hair's breadth. That's the same as missing by miles. I remember he looked at Mary, as if for confirmation, but she did not smile or nod. Her face was very grave, and her eyes looked steadily at him. Then they moved and met mine, and they seemed to give me marching orders. Sir Walter, I said, 3 years ago you and I sat in this very room. We thought we were done to the world, as we think now. With just that one miserable little clue to hang on to, a dozen words scribbled in a notebook by a dead man. You thought I was mad when I asked for Scudder's book, but we put our backs into the job, and in 24 hours we'd won out. Remember that then we were fighting against time. Now we have a reasonable amount of leisure. Then we had nothing but a sentence of gibberish. Now we have a great body of knowledge, for Blencaron has been brooding over Ivory like an old hen, and he knows his ways of working and his breed of confederate. You've got something to work on now. Do you mean to tell me that when the stakes are so big, you're going to chuck in your hand? McGillivray raised his head. We know a good deal about Ivory, but Ivory's dead. We know nothing of the man who was gloriously resurrected this evening in Normandy. Oh, yes, we do. There are many faces to the man, but only one mind, and you know plenty about that mind. I wonder, said Sir Walter, how can you know a mind which has no characteristics except that it is wholly and supremely confident? Mere mental powers won't give us a clue. We want to know the character which is behind all the personalities. Above all, we want to know its foibles. If we only had a hint of some weakness, we might make a plan. Well, let's set down all we know, I cried, for the more I argued, the keener I grew. I told them in some detail the story of the night in the Coolin, and what I'd heard there. There's the two names, Chelius and Beaumarts. The man spoke to them in the same breath as Elfenbein, so they must be associated with Ivory's gang. You've got to get the whole Secret Service of the Allies busy to fit a meaning to those two words. Surely to goodness you'll find something. And remember, those names don't belong to the Ivory part, but to the big game behind all the different disguises. Then there's the talk about the wild birds and the cage birds. I haven't a guess at what that means, but it refers to some infernal gang, and among your piles of records there must be some clue. You set the intelligence of two hemispheres busy on the job, You've got all the machinery, and it's my experience that even one solitary man keeps chewing on a problem who discovers something." My enthusiasm was beginning to strike sparks from McGillivray. He was looking thoughtful now, instead of despondent. "There might be something in that," he said, "but it's a far-out chance." "Of course it's a far-out chance, and that's all we're ever going to get from Ivory. But we've taken a bad chance before, and won." "Then you have all you know about Ivory here. Go through his dossier with a small tooth comb, and I'll bet you'll find something to work on. Blenkiron, you're a man with a cool head. You admit we've a sporting chance?" "Sure, Dick. He's fixed things so that the lines are across the track, but we're clear somehow. So far as John S. Blenkiron is concerned, he's just got one thing to do in this world, and that's to follow the yellow dog and have him neatly and cleanly tidied up. I've got a stack of personal affronts to settle. I was easy fruit, and he hasn't been very respectful. You can count me in, Dick." "Then we're agreed," I cried. "Well, gentlemen, it's up to you to arrange the first stage. You've some pretty solid staff work to put in before you get on the trail." "And you?" Sir Walter asked. "I'm going back to my brigade. I want a rest and a change. Besides, the first stage is office work, and I'm no use for that. But I'll be waiting to be summoned, and I'll come like a shot as soon as you hoik me out. I've got a presentiment about this thing. I know there'll be a finish, and that I'll be in at it, and I think it will be desperate bloody business too." I found Mary's eyes fixed upon me, and in them I read the same thought. She had not spoken a word, but had sat on the edge of a chair, swinging a foot idly, one hand playing with an ivory fan. She had given me my old orders, and I looked to her for confirmation of the new. "Miss Lamington, you're the wisest of the lot of us. What do you say?" She smiled, that shy, companionable smile which I'd been picturing to myself all through the wanderings of the past month. "I think you're right. We've a long way to go yet, for the Valley of Humiliation comes only halfway in the Pilgrim's Progress. The next stage is Vanity Fair. I might be of some use there, don't you think?" I remember the way she laughed and flung back her head like a gallant boy. "The mistake we've all been making," she said, "is that our methods are too terre-à-terre. We've a poet to deal with, a great poet, and we must fling our imaginations forward to catch up with him. His strength is the unexpectedness, you know, and we won't beat him by plodding only. I believe the wildest course is the wisest, and for it's most likely to intersect with his. Who's the poet amongst us?" "Peter," I said, "but he's pinned down with a game leg in Germany. All the same, we must rope him in." By this time we had all cheered up, for it was wonderful what a tonic there is in a prospect of action. The butler brought in the tea, which was Bullivant's habit to drink after dinner. To me it seemed fantastic to watch a slip of a girl pouring it out for two grizzled and distinguished servants of the state, and one battered soldier, as decorous as a family party as you would ask to see, and to reflect that all four were engaged in an enterprise where men's lives must be reckoned at less than a thistledown. After that we went upstairs to a noble Georgian dining-room, where Mary played to us. I don't care two straws for music from an instrument, unless it be the pipes or a regimental band. But I dearly love the human voice. But she would not sing, for singing to her, I fancy, was something that did not come at will, but flowed only like a bird's note when the mood favoured. I did not want it either. I was content to let Cherry Ripe be the one song linked with her in my memory. It was McGillivray who brought us back to business. I wish to heaven there was one habit of mind we could definitely attach to him, and to no one else. At this moment he had only one meaning for us. "You can't do nothing with his mind," Blenkiron drawled. "You can't loose the bands of Orion, as the Bible says, or hold Leviathan with a hook. I reckon I could make a mighty close study of his devices, but the darned cuss wouldn't stay put. I thought I'd tied him down to the double bluff, and he went and played the triple bluff on me. There's nothing doing along that line." The memory of Peter recurred to me. "What about the blind spot?" I asked, and I told them old Peter's pet theory. Every man that God has made has his weak spot somewhere, some flaw in his character which leaves a dull patch in his brain. We've got to find that out, and I think I've made a beginning. McGillivray, in a sharp voice, asked my meaning. "He's in a funk, or something. Oh, I don't mean he's a coward. A man in his trade wants the nerve of a buffalo. He could give us all points in courage. What I mean is that he's not clean white all through. There are yellow streaks somewhere in him. I've given a good deal of thought to this courage business, for I haven't got a great deal of it myself, not like Peter, I mean. I've got heaps of soft places in me. I'm afraid of being drowned, for one thing, or of getting my eye shot out. Ivory's afraid of bombs. At any rate, he's afraid of bombs in a big city. I once read a book which talked about a thing called agoraphobia. Perhaps it's that. Now, if we know that weak spot, it helps us in our work. There are some places he won't go to. There are some things he can't do. Well, not well, anyway. I reckon that's useful. Yes, said McGillivray. Perhaps it's not what you'd call a burning and shining light. There's another chink in his armour, I went on. There's one person in the world he can never practice his transformations on, and that's me. I shall always know him again, though he appeared as Sir Douglas Haig. I can't explain why, but I've got a feel in my bones about it. I didn't recognise him before, for I thought he was dead, and the nerve in my brain, which should have been looking for him, wasn't working. But now I'm on my guard, and that nerve's functioning at full power. Whenever and wherever and howsoever we meet again in the face of the earth, it will be Dr. Livingstone, I presume, between him and me. That is better, said McGillivray. If we have any luck, Hanny, it won't be long till we pull you out of His Majesty's forces. Mary got up from the piano and resumed her old perch on the arm of Sir Walter's chair. There's another blind spot which you haven't mentioned. It was a cool evening, but I noticed that her cheeks were suddenly flushed. Last week, Mr. Ivory asked me to marry him, she said. Now it's time to get back to the King in Yellow. This is part 6 and the final part of The Street of Our Lady of the Fields. Part 6. It was with another quick heartbeat that he awoke the next morning, for his first thought was of Valentine. The sun already gilded the towers of Notre Dame. The clatter of workmen's sabots already sharp echoes in the street below, and across the way a blackbird in a pink almond tree was going into an ecstasy of trills. He determined to awake Clifford for a brisk walk in the country, hoping later to beguile that gentleman into the American church for his soul's sake. He found Alfred, the gimlet-eyed, washing the asphalt walk which led to the studio. Monsieur Elliot, he replied to the perfunctory inquiry. Je ne sais quoi? And Monsieur Clifford, began Hastings, somewhat astonished. Monsieur Clifford, said the concierge with fine irony, will be pleased to see you, as he retired early. In fact, he has just come in. Hastings hesitated while the concierge pronounced a fine eulogy on people who never stayed out all night and then came battering at the lodge gate during hours which even a gendarme held sacred to sleep. He also discoursed eloquently upon the beauties of temperance, and took an ostentatious draught from the fountain in the court. I do not think I will come in, said Hastings. Pardon, monsieur, growled the concierge. Perhaps it would be well to see Monsieur Clifford. He possibly needs aid. Me he drives forth with hairbrushes and boots. It is a mercy if he has not set fire to something with his candle. Hastings hesitated for an instant, but swallowing his dislike of such a mission, walked slowly through the ivory-covered alley and across the inner garden to the studio. He knocked. Perfect silence. Then he knocked again, and this time something struck the door from within with a crash. That, said the concierge, was a boot. He fitted his duplicate key into the lock and ushered Hastings in. Clifford, in disordered evening clothes, sat on the rug in the middle of the room. He held in his hand a shoe, and did not appear astonished to see Hastings. "Good morning. Do you use Pear's soap?" he inquired, with a vague wave of his hand and a vaguer smile. Hastings' heart sank. "Heaven's sake," he said. "Clifford, go to bed." "Not while that Alfred pokes his shaggy head in here, and I have a shoe left." Hastings blew out the candle, picked up Clifford's hat and cane, and said with an emotion he could not conceal, "This is terrible, Clifford. I never knew you did this sort of thing." "Well, I do," said Clifford. "Where is Elliot?" "Old chap," returned Clifford, becoming maudlin. "Providence which feeds... sparrows and that sort of thing watcheth over the intemperate wanderer. Where is Elliot? But Clifford only wagged his head and waved his arm about. He's out there somewhere about. Then, suddenly feeling a desire to see his missing chum, lifted up his voice and howled for him. Hastings, thoroughly shocked, sat down on the lounge without a word. Presently, after shedding several scalding tears, Clifford brightened up and rose with great precaution. "Old chap," he observed, "do you want to see a miracle? Well, here goes. I'm going to begin." He paused, beaming at vacancy. A miracle," he repeated. Hastings supposed he was alluding to the miracle of his keeping balance, and said nothing. "I'm going to bed," he announced. "Poor old Clifford's going to bed, and that's a miracle." And he did, with a nice calculation of distance and equilibrium which would have wrung enthusiastic yells of applause from Elliot had he been there to assist en connoisseur. But he was not. He had not yet reached the studio. He was on his way, however, and smiled with magnificent condescension on Hastings, who half an hour later found him reclining upon a bench in the Luxembourg. He permitted himself to be aroused, dusted, and escorted to the gate. Here, however, he refused all further assistance, and bestowing a patronizing bow upon Hastings, steered a tolerably true course for the Rue Vavin. Hastings watched him out of sight, and then slowly retraced his steps towards the fountain. At first he felt gloomy and depressed, but gradually the clear air of the morning lifted the pressure from his heart, and he sat down on the marble seat under the shadow of the winged god. The air was fresh and sweet with perfume from the orange flowers. Everywhere pigeons were bathing, dashing the water over their iris-hued breasts, flashing in and out of the spray, or nestling almost to the neck along the polished basin. The sparrows, too, were abroad in force, soaking their dust-coloured feathers in the limpid pool and chirping with might and main. Under the sycamores which surrounded the duck pond opposite the fountain of Marie de Medici, the waterfowl cropped the herbage, or waddled in rows down the bank to embark on some solemn, aimless cruise. Butterflies, somewhat lame from a chilly night's repose under the lilac leaves, crawled over and over the white phlox, or took a rheumatic flight towards some sun-warmed shrub. The bees were already busy amongst the heliotrope, and one or two grey flies with brick-coloured eyes sat in a spot of sunlight beside the marble seat, or chased each other about, only to return again to the spot of sunshine and rub their forelegs, exulting. The sentries paced briskly before the painted boxes, pausing at times to look towards the guard-house for their relief. They came at last, with a shuffle of feet and a click of bayonets. The word was passed, the relief fell out, and away they went, crunch, 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 across the gravel. A mellow chime floated from the clock tower of the palace. The deep bell of St. Sulpice echoed the stroke, and Hastings sat, dreaming in the shadow of the god, and while he mused, somebody came and sat down beside him. At first he did not raise his head. It was only when she spoke that he sprang up. "You? At this hour?" I was restless. I could not sleep. And then in a low, happy voice, "And you? At this hour?" I slept, but the sun awoke me." "I could not sleep," she said, and her eyes seemed for a moment touched with an indefinable shadow. Then, smiling, "I'm so glad. I seemed to know you were coming. Don't laugh. I believe in dreams." "Did you really dream? Dream of my being here?" "I think I was awake when I dreamed it," she admitted, and then for a time they were mute, acknowledging by silence the happiness of being together. And after all their silence was eloquent, for faint smiles and glances born of their thoughts crossed and recrossed, until lips moved and words were formed, which seemed almost superfluous. What they said was not very profound. Perhaps the most valuable jewel that fell from Hastings's lips bore direct reference to breakfast. "I have not yet had my chocolate," she confessed, "but what a material man you are." "Valentine," he said impulsively, I do wish that you would just this once give me the whole day, just for this once." "Oh dear," she smiled, "not only material, but selfish." Not selfish. Hungry, he said, looking at her. A cannibal too? Oh dear. Will you, Valentine? But my chocolate. Take it with me. Pas de gêne. Together at St. Cloud. But I can't. Together all day long, will you, Valentine? She was silent. Only for this once. Again that indefinable shadow fell across her eyes, and when it was gone she sighed, Yes. Together, but only for this once. All day, he said, doubting his happiness. All day, she smiled. And I am so hungry. He laughed, enchanted. What a material young lady it is. On the Boulevard St. there is a cremerie, painted white and blue outside, and neat and clean as a whistle inside. The auburn-haired young woman, who speaks French like a native, and rejoices in the name of Murphy, smiled at them as they entered, and tossing a fresh napkin over the zinc tete-a-tete table, whisked before them 2 cups of chocolate and a basketful of crisp, fresh croissants. The primrose-coloured pats of butter, each stamped with a shamrock in relief, seemed saturated with the fragrance of Normandy pastures. How delicious, they said in the same breath, and then laughed at the coincidence. With but a single thought, he began. How absurd, she cried, with cheeks all rosy. I'm thinking I'd like a croissant. So am I, he replied, triumphant. That proves it. And then they had a quarrel, she accusing him of behaviour unworthy of a child in arms, and he denying it, and bringing counter-charges, until Mademoiselle Murphy laughed in sympathy, and the last croissant was eaten under a flag of truce. Then they rose, and she took his arm with a bright nod to Mile, Murphy, who cried out with a merry Bonjour, madame, bonjour, monsieur, and watched them hail a passing cab and drive away. Dieu, qui elle est beau, she sighed, adding after a moment, Do they be married? I dunno. Ma foi, il bon bien lié. The cab swung around the Rue de Medici, turned into the Rue de Vaugirard, and followed it to where it crosses the Rue de Rennes, and taking that noisy thoroughfare, drew up before the Gare Montparnasse. They were just in time for a train, and scampered up the stairway and out to the cars as the last note from the starting gong rang through the arched station. The guard slammed the door of their compartment. A whistle sounded, answered by a screech from the locomotive, and the long train glided from the station, faster, faster, and sped out into the morning sunshine. The summer wind blew in their faces from the open window, and sent the soft hair dancing from the girl's forehead. We have the compartment to ourselves, said Hastings. She leaned against the cushioned window-seat, her eyes bright and wide open, her lips parted. The wind lifted her hat and fluttered the ribbons under her chin. With a quick movement she untied them, and drawing a long hat-pin from her hat, laid it down on the seat beside her. The train was flying. The colour surged in her cheeks, and with each quick-drawn breath, her breath rose and fell under the cluster of lilies at her throat. Trees, houses, ponds danced past, cut by a mist of telegraph poles. Faster, faster, she cried. His eyes never left her, but hers, wide open and blue as the summer sky, seemed fixed on something far ahead, something which came no nearer, but fled before them as they fled. Was it the horizon, cut now by a grim fortress on the hill, now by the cross of a country chapel? Was it the summer moon, ghost-like, slipping through the vaguer blue above? Faster, faster, she cried. Her parted lips burned scarlet. The car shook and shivered, and the fields streamed by like an emerald torrent. He caught the excitement, and his face glowed. Oh, she cried, and with an unconscious movement caught his hand, drawing him to the window beside her. Look, lean out with me. He only saw her lips move. Her voice was drowned in the roar of a trestle, but his hand closed in hers, and he caught to the sill. The wind whistled in their ears. Not so far out, Valentine. Take care, he gasped. Below, through the ties of the trestle, a broad river flashed into view and out again as the train thundered along a tunnel and away once more through the freshest of green fields. The wind roared about them. The girl was leaning out far from the window, and he caught her by the waist, crying, "Not too far!" But she only murmured, "Faster, faster!" Away out of the city, out of the land, faster, faster, away from the world. "What are you saying all to yourself?" he said. But his voice was broken, and the wind whirled it back into his throat. She heard him, and turning from the window, looked down at his arm about her. Then she raised her eyes to his. The car shook and the windows rattled. They were dashing through a forest now, and the sun swept the dewy branches with running flashes of fire. He looked into her troubled eyes. He drew her to him, and kissed the half-parted lips, and she cried out, a bitter, hopeless cry. "Not that! Not that!" But he held her close and strong, whispering words of honest love and passion, and when she sobbed, "Not that, not that, I have promised. You must know I am not worthy." In the purity of his own heart, her words were to him meaningless then, meaningless for ever after. Presently her voice ceased, and her head rested on his breast. He leaned against the window, his ears swept by the furious wind, his heart in a joyous tumult. The forest was past, and the sun slipped from behind the trees, flooding the earth again with brightness. She raised her eyes and looked out into the world from the window. Then she began to speak, but her voice was faint, and he bent his head close to hers and listened. "I cannot turn from you. I am too weak. You were long ago my master, master of my heart and my soul. I have broken my word to one who trusted me. But I've told you all. What matters the rest?" He smiled at her innocence, and she worshipped his. She spoke again. "Take me or cast me away. What matters it? Now, with a word, you can kill me. And it might be easier to die than to look upon happiness as great as mine." He took her in his arms. "Hush! What are you saying? Look at the sunlight, the meadows and the streams. We shall be very happy in so bright a world." She turned to the sunlight. From the window, the world below seemed very fair to her. Trembling with happiness, she sighed, "Is this the world? Then I have never known it." "Nor have I. God forgive me," he murmured. Perhaps it was our gentle Lady of the Fields who forgave them both. And The King in Yellow will continue next time. That's all, except to let you know that my latter-day Lovecraftian short story called Second Incursion is available to purchase as an e-book from the Kindle store. It's a standalone sequel to Incursion, which is also available on the Kindle store. Opening music was provided by Victor Valdez from the Symbol Project. This file is released on an attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives license. So, until next time.
CthulhuPodcast.co.uk